Okay, hello and welcome to this lecture in a different room this time, so I'm hoping the light and everything is okay. So this lecture is going to look at criticisms of human rights, the ways in which human rights have been criticized, the concept of human rights has been criticized. To begin with, just a reminder of what we mean by human rights. So human rights are those rights to which all human beings are entitled simply by virtue of being human. And they're often said to be universal, inalienable or fundamental, and absolute. So what we mean by this is that human rights are universal in the sense that they apply to all regardless of age, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. They are inalienable or fundamental in the sense that they cannot be removed from people. People cannot be stripped of these rights. And absolute in the sense that they are to apply in all circumstances. So basically this lecture is going to follow a structure of identified three broad types of critique of human rights, if you like. So firstly, we're going to look at the philosophical critique of human rights, which broadly comes under the heading of cultural relativism. Secondly, we're going to look at the post-colonial critique, which is more of a political criticism emanating from the global south and the newly independent countries of the global south following decolonization. And thirdly, we're going to look at the realist critique. Remember, realism is a school of thought within international relations that views international relations very much in terms of power politics, in terms of what's called realpolitik, which is the idea that basically politics and international politics is not driven by principles or values. It's driven by each state acting to maximize their power at the expense of everyone else in their own national interest. So those are the three broad schools of criticism, if you like, that we're going to look at. So firstly, let's look at the philosophical critique of the concept of human rights. And as I say, this broadly comes under the category of cultural relativism. Now, just before we go into it, what we mean by relativism is the idea, relativism can be seen as the opposite of universalism. So universalism is the idea that there are values, value systems, and so on that are universal in the sense of really apply to all cultures in all times and all people and so on. So relativism is the opposite of that actually argues that there are no universal values, that actually each culture, each society's values are exclusive, if you like, to that cultural society, and that you can't generalize across time and space to find genuinely universal values. So you can see straight off the bat that this is clearly going to be, this concept of relativism is clearly going to be problematic in the context of universal human rights. So the basic position of the cultural relativists, as I say, is that there's no such thing as universal values, that all values are the products of the society or culture that produced them. And therefore you can't extrapolate principles that apply globally across all time and space. Therefore, if we focus in on human rights, then rights are said to emerge from culturally embedded values, and they can't be abstracted from them. They can't be removed from the culture in which they originally came about. And this critique has a long history. So there's even some overlap. A lot of traditional conservatives are actually in some ways cultural relatives. So if you look at someone like Edmund Burke, who was the MP for Bristol just over 200 years ago, considered to be the godfather, the founding father, if you like, of modern conservatism, he, as a traditional conservative, believes in tradition as, you know, the ultimate foundational guiding force for society. And of course, if you believe in tradition, then each tradition is going to be different for each culture or society at each different time. So someone like Edmund Burke, a traditional conservative in that mode, and in that mold, would be a cultural relativist in the sense of believing that each culture's values are produced historically by that culture's circumstance and cannot be applied to everyone else in the world. Two particular variants, if you like, of cultural relativism. We can look at Communitarianism, which is a specific strand of thought within international relations, which is basically based on cultural relativism, really. It's the idea that each community has their own value system that must be respected. So we can't just start to dictate to other cultures the rights and principles that they should live by. Another form, if you like, or closely related criticism of human rights, closely related to cultural relativism, would be postmodernism. And postmodernism is a branch of philosophy that became very popular really from the 1980s onwards, associated with thinkers like Michel Foucault. And this is the idea that, well, really postmodernism, it questions the very notion of objective truth. And therefore questions the notion that you can have universal values as well, because if you can't establish really what is true, then how can you establish that a particular value system or set of rights is applicable to anyone? So postmodernism is a relatively popular form, if you like, of cultural relativism, become quite popular within philosophy in the last few decades. So I hope that gives you a bit of an understanding of what we mean by cultural relativism. As I say, just to repeat, it's a simple idea really, which is that all values are rooted in and cannot be removed from the culture or society which produced them, and therefore any value or principle cannot be applied to all cultures or societies. It's specific to the societal circumstances that gave rise to it. Okay, so let's move on to the post-colonial critique. Now, the post-colonial critique is, in a way, it would share a lot of the positions of cultural relativism, but it's more of a political critique than a philosophical one, although it does build on some of the observations of the cultural relativists, if you like. So, the post-colonial criticism of human rights post-colonialists would share the skepticism of cultural relativists towards universal values. And more specifically, the post-colonial critique would see human rights specifically as a concept rooted in Western liberal ideology, and therefore not suited necessarily to non-Western cultures. Let's consider this for a moment. So, in particular, the post-colonial criticism would look at the fact that human rights seems to be specifically rooted in this concept of individualism. Yeah, that a society is made up of separate, autonomous individuals. Now, individualism they would argue, well, this is a very modern Western liberal concept. So how can you say that a whole system of rights that's based on this very Western concept can be genuinely universal? So let me flesh this out a bit. So they would say, well, already embedded and assumed in the very concept of universal human rights are a number of assumptions that are very much Western assumptions, if you like. For example, the prioritizing of rights over duties, the prioritizing of individualism over any form of collectivism or community, the prioritizing of individual autonomy over, for example, social harmony, the prioritizing of, let's say, each individual family member rather than the belief in the family as a social unit as a whole. So all of these assumptions are built into the concept of human rights, and yet the post-colonialists would argue, well, these are very modern Western liberal assumptions. They're not necessarily shared by other cultures or applicable to other cultures. So let me give you an example of this criticism in political practice, if you like. In 1993, there was a declaration made called the Bangkok Declaration, which was a large number of Asian states declaring what they called Asian values. And they argued really that the concept of universal human rights was based on this individualism, which actually clashed with Asian values, which they said Asian cultures are built on and which need to be respected. So, for example, they said, well, an Asian value would be actually prioritizing duties over individual rights, prioritizing community over the individual, prioritizing social harmony over individual autonomy, and so on. And things like respect for authority might be prioritized over, for example, freedom of speech. There's many ways we can see the Bangkok Declaration as problematic. We'll go into that next week. But just for now, I just want you to have an idea in your head of this idea of Asian values and how these were said to conflict with the concept of universal human rights, which was said to be a very Western-centric concept rooted in very Western societal assumptions. Another example, and again just honing in a bit more precisely here on where Western and non-Western societies might come into conflict over their interpretation of human rights, we could look at Kwame Nkrumah. He was the leader of the first black African independent state after the colonial period. Ghana gained its independence in 1957. And he had led the anti-colonial struggle and became the first president of independent Ghana. He literally wrote the textbook on neocolonialism. This is the name of his book, Neocolonialism. He's the one who popularized the phrase. And if we look at, Nkrumah argued basically that even this concept of freedom of association, the freedom to join any political party you like and partake in, which is closely linked to the idea of multi-party democracy, where different parties stand in competitive elections against one another for government. He argued, well, this is not necessarily appropriate for every society. He argued actually multi-party democracy in the context of